In the winter of 1257 to 1258, when the frost still silvered the date palms along the Tigris and the call to prayer drifted over a city that had ruled the Islamic world for exactly 500 years, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brother of Munka the Great Khan and of Kublai, who would one day rule China, crossed the Zagros Mountains with the largest army the Mongols had ever assembled west of the Oxus. 200,000 horsemen, 10,000 Chinese siege engineers, 1,000 counterweight trebuchets that could hurl 300-pound stones farther than any catapult known to Islam, 500 naphtha throwers, 10,000 Armenian and Georgian auxiliaries, and the cold, deliberate fury of a man who had been ordered by the Great Khan himself to end the Abbasid Caliphate once and for all, or never return alive, and Baghdad, the round city built by al-Mansur in 762, the city of Harun al-Rashid and the 1,001 Knights, the city whose house of wisdom had once translated Aristotle into Arabic while Europe still burned witches, the city of 700,000 souls, 40,000 mosques, 30,000 bathhouses, and a library that held more books than existed in all of Christendom, prepared to meet the storm with a caliph who believed that God and diplomacy would protect him, a vizier who hoarded gold instead of grain, and an army of barely 20,000 half-starved soldiers who had not been paid in months, while Hulagu, riding beneath the black yak-tail standard of the Ilkhan, encircled the greatest metropolis of the medieval world with a ring of iron and fire that would, in 13 apocalyptic days, drown the Tigris in ink, bury the Caliph in a carpet and trample him to death, and murder between 200,000 and 800,000 human beings, ending 5 centuries of Abbasid rule and turning the intellectual heart of Islam into a charnel house whose stench lingered for generations. The decision had been taken far away, in the summer of 1251, at the great Kurultai on the Onon River, where Munka was proclaimed Great Khan, and immediately dispatched his brothers on missions of conquest, Kublai to finish the song in southern China, Hulagu to subdue everything from the Oxus to the Nile, and the order to Hulagu was explicit. The Ismaili assassins of Alamut must be exterminated root and branch, the Caliphate of Baghdad must be destroyed, and if the Caliph refused submission, the city itself must cease to exist. Hulagu spent 6 years preparing. He crushed the assassins in 1256, burning their library at Alamut and slaughtering every Fadayan from Persia to Syria. He recruited the Christian kingdoms of Armenia and Georgia with promises of loot. He forced the Seljuks of Rum to supply grain and horses. And above all, he gathered the finest Chinese siege corps the world had ever seen. Men who had reduced Xiangyang and knew how to build trebuchets that could throw firebombs filled with saltpeter, sulfur, and naphtha, over 300 yards, and when he finally crossed the Oxus in 1257, the earth itself seemed to tremble, for the Mongols did not come as raiders, but as the wrath of heaven incarnate. Baghdad in 1258 was still dazzling, even in decline. The Tigris flowed through its heart, spanned by pontoon bridges of teak and iron, its banks lined with palaces of glazed brick, its markets fragrant with frankincense and cloves, its scholars arguing in the shade of the Mustansiriya madrasa that had been completed only 25 years earlier, its Caliph, al-Musta'sim Billah, the 37th Abbasid, living in a riverside palace surrounded by poets, musicians, and 3,000 black eunuchs, while the city's walls, built by generations of caliphs, still rose 30 feet high with 110 towers and a moat fed by the Tigris itself. The vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, a Shiite secretly sympathetic to the Mongols, had spent years siphoning the treasury into his own coffers, instead of repairing the walls or paying the army, and when Hulagu's envoys arrived in 1257, demanding submission, earth and water, and the dismantling of the fortifications, al-Musta'sim, advised by astrologers who claimed the stars favored Baghdad and by courtiers who whispered that the Mongols would melt in the Iraqi heat, sent back insults wrapped in silk, boasting that the prayer of the Caliph alone would destroy the infidels, and thus sealed the fate of his city. Hulagu reached the western bank of the Tigris on January 18, 1258, and immediately began the encirclement. He divided his forces into 5 great camps, one on the western side under his personal command, one to the north under Baiju, one to the south under the Georgian king, and 2 on the eastern bank to prevent escape, while the Chinese engineers set to work with demonic speed, felling every palm tree for miles to build 1,000 counterweight trebuchets, each capable of hurling a stone the weight of a horse 300 yards, and smaller mangonels that threw clay pots of burning naphtha that exploded on impact. And within days, the sky above Baghdad was black with projectiles, stones smashing through roofs, firebombs setting entire districts ablaze, the bombardment so continuous that the call to prayer was drowned by the roar of collapsing masonry. By the fifth day, the outer western wall was breached in 7 places, and Mongol storming parties in lamella armor poured through, cutting down the defenders who fought with desperate courage, their scimitars flashing against Mongol sabers. But the Iraqi troops were outnumbered 10-1 and half-starved, and when the eastern wall began to crack under the weight of concentrated trebuchet fire, the Caliph finally panicked and sent emissaries offering submission. But Hulagu, remembering the fate of those who had surrendered at Merv and Nishapur only to be massacred anyway, demanded that the Caliph come out in person with all his treasure, and every soldier lay down arms, and when al-Musta'sim hesitated, the bombardment resumed with redoubled fury. And on February 10, 1258, 13 days after the siege began, the city fell. What followed was not war but annihilation. Hulagu had given explicit orders. Muslims were to be killed without mercy, Christians and Jews were to be spared, they had opened their quarters gates early, and the Caliph's palace was to be taken intact. Mongol troops rode through the streets, slaughtering at will, cutting down men, women, children, scholars, poets, imams, the blood running in rivers toward the Tigris. And for 7 days the killing continued, while the House of Wisdom, the greatest library in the world, was torn apart book by book. Its manuscripts, translations of Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, works of algebra, astronomy, medicine, poetry, theology, were thrown into the river until the Tigris ran black with ink, and the horses slipped on the wet parchment that carpeted the banks, and the smell of blood and burning books hung over the city like a shroud. On February 20th, the Caliph was brought before Hulagu in chains, his 300 concubines and eunuchs trailing behind. Hulagu, seated on a golden throne beneath a silk parasol, reproached him. "You are the fisherman who kept the fish for himself while the people starved. Now eat your treasure." He had chests of gold and jewels opened and forced the Caliph to swallow pearls until he choked. Then, following the Mongol custom that royal blood must not touch the earth, al-Musta'sim was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, his body kicked aside like offal, while his sons were beheaded and their heads displayed on pikes. The slaughter lasted 40 days. Estimates range from 200,000 to 800,000 dead. The higher figures from Persian chroniclers who counted every soul in the suburbs and surrounding villages. The Mongols worked in shifts, resting only to drink ayrag and roast sheep, while the Tigris carried bloated corpses downstream for weeks. When Hulagu finally withdrew in March 1258, fearing the summer heat and plague, Baghdad was a city of the dead. Palaces burned, mosques roofless, libraries ash, canals clogged with bodies. The round city reduced to blackened ruins, where only the sparrows nested in the broken domes. The consequences were eternal. The Abbasid Caliphate, spiritual leaders of Sunni Islam for half a millennium, was extinguished forever. The irrigation systems that had fed Mesopotamia since Babylonian times were destroyed, turning fertile fields into desert. The intellectual light of the Islamic Golden Age was snuffed out in a single week. Centuries of scholarship dissolved in the Tigris. Egypt's Mamluks would defeat the Mongols at Ain Jalut 2 years later, halting the westward advance, but Baghdad never recovered. For 700 years it remained a provincial backwater until oil revived it in the 20th century. The ink that blackened the Tigris in 1258 still stains history, a permanent reminder that even the greatest cities can be murdered in 13 days when pride meets the steppe, when a caliph trusts in astrologers instead of walls, and when the heirs of Genghis Khan ride with Chinese engineers and the cold certainty that the world belongs to the strongest.